Rama, you can only really talk duality. Yeah. Non-duality couldn't be talked because it's not a thing. But duality can be talked about because you can see it. You can see what pops up as subject-object relationship. Yeah, so that's really when we do these talks, they're about duality. It's like Ramana said, the only requirement is to see the unreal, because reality you can't see because it wouldn't be a thing. Yeah? So you can't really talk about the absolute. Any words that you put on it would give it some kind of form which would just diminish it or break it apart into pieces. So really what we're talking about is duality. In order to see it, to see the face of it so that it can be negated. Not so that duality can be reinforced, or the individual can be made to be way better or something like that. Yeah, it's seen so that it can be negated as not your absolute nature. Because what arises in duality is of this phenomenal world, let's say, it's happening. And so it's relative, meaning it's in relation to everything else. However, it's not the absolute. Now, the relative is taking itself to be the absolute for sure. Uh, yeah. So when we're talking, we're really talking about duality. Because there's no wording in non-duality. Yeah. In a way, there is no duality and there is no non-duality. These are simply ideas which are put on which are presented in order to try to, man, for the human to try to understand what's going on, in a way, yeah, or understand what they're not. More importantly, this is the key of this thing: is to understand what you're not. Mm-hmm. Because that's the only thing that can be experienced in a way. Now, the head, when there's a bunch of experiencing going on, like a bunch of objects, places itself as the ultimate subject. And that is the representation of duality. But really, all that can happen is experiencing, despite the idea that the head is putting you there as the experiencer. So a lot of people will say, well, I feel non-duality, or I can experience non-duality. But that is duality, because there's an experiencer placed there by the head, which is taken to be you, who's experiencing non-duality. There can't be an experiencing of nothing, yeah, because that would mean that there's someone placed there by the mental system, turning nothing into an object, which would be turning it into something, seemingly. Yeah. This is the thing. So we can only talk about duality because you can't touch the idea of non-duality or what it's pointing to with words or anything else. Mm-hmm. So it's very important to see that the mental system claims everything that it comes in contact with, including being the experiencer of non-duality. Yeah? The head will try to claim this message, and that's not the relief. That's bonded. That is the bondage of self. It's just the head will put itself as now the knower of non-duality, which seems much more noble, but it's the same thing knowing that you're taking a pee, essentially. There's no difference between those two. It's still placing us to be the knower. The mental system is doing this. Mm. So when we're talking about duality. In order for that duality to be negated, yeah, not to be fostered, or as they would say in Buddhism, cherished, like self-cherishing. Mm. But to see how that subject object or two-ness arises so that it can be negated. It doesn't have to be destroyed because it's not a thing which is alive. So there's no ego that has to be killed, or there doesn't have to be some kind of ego death or whatever that means, because it's not alive, yeah? It's a coming and going. It's like a presentation or a movie where scenes are just kind of flying through, creating a seeming story of you. The head is like that. It's like a movie which is playing, and it's presenting constantly the story of you in what it would consider time. So the past you, the future you, and the you that's here now. And the movie is playing like this in scenes. So the head is placing you as the one who's seeing the movie. And that's part of the movie. This is why we can only talk about duality, because the one that the you that is seeing the movie is part of the movie. So any speaking or something is happening within duality. It's the only place where it can happen. So again, this isn't like a denying of the happening of that, but it's seeing that it's not happening to a you. And this is the most important aspect, because if you're taken to be the one who knows non-duality, you're taken to be the one who is depressed or has depressed thoughts or has anxious thoughts or holds the body kind of thing, yeah. It's always you at the center of it. And that's the bondage of self. Doesn't matter how self is presenting, whether it's a depressed addict or an alcoholic or whether it's the enlightened one, it's still the bondage of self. Either way. So if there's a knower of non-duality, that's duality. There's a subject and object there. Yeah. So if there's any questions, please let me know, because it just moves things through. Or to riff on in a way. Yeah. Otherwise, maybe we'll come into this reading here. I want to read this thing from this book, Prior to Consciousness, which is a book from, well, it's not from Nisargadatta, but it's annotated from his talks. I really like this this piece. So I'm just gonna pick some things here from Prior to Consciousness. When he talks about consciousness in this book, he's not talking about big M mind. So he's not talking about absolute nature. He's speaking of the first mental movement that happens out of non-duality, since we were just saying. He's talking about the first movement that happens which breaks everything into duality. Yeah, the first like presentation, which would be the sense of being the one, or I, or me, or something. So he refers to that as consciousness, yeah. So he says, so long as the body is there, you are this consciousness. But once the body and the consciousness go, you are that original state upon which all of this has come as a temporary state. Your original state is changeless and permanent. So that gives you a lot of clues as far as to what to negate in your experience. If your original state, or as they might say in Buddhism, your original face, is changeless and permanent, everything that's arising within that would be changing and impermanent, yeah? Which would include the idea of you. Because the idea of you changes a lot. Yeah, it'd be constantly roles. Let's say roles of the character in the life. Now all those roles seem to arise to a sense of you. That would be the sense of consciousness. So long as the body is there, you are this consciousness, yes? So, the mind interprets to the body of which is a part, which is like what A Course in Miracles says. You can't separate the body and that movement, that first movement of consciousness. When you say I, the head is referring to the non-existent you, but as the body. Yeah. When you say I, it's referring to the body. So when the head is claiming everything to be happening to you, it's happening to the body. That's very important to see. So as soon as that I comes up, there is the body. Those two things arise and die together, is what he's saying. But once the body and consciousness go, whether it's through inquiry or negation or whatever thing is going on, yeah, once the body and consciousness go, you are that original state, which means you are not tied to the body and consciousness. It is only through identification with the body and the consciousness, the mental movement, that you're seemingly tied to it. But he is saying, once the body and the consciousness go, you are that original state. No, so it's wouldn't be considered a state because it's perfect. States would come and go, but it's just a wording thing. So once the body and the consciousness go, which means the body and the consciousness are constantly born and unborn. They're born and they die, born and die. It's like the Zen Master Banki would say, you are the unborn. So everything that's moving through, born and dies. Yeah? That would be another dualistic movement. Whatever comes up goes, including the idea of you. When you go to sleep, into deep sleep at night, you seemingly disappear. The idea of you is gone, yeah? But obviously there's something still there. Okay. Good. So, but which, all of this has come as a temporary state. So he's talking about the mind and the body, yeah? Your original state is changeless and permanent. Changeless and permanent. So if you look at the experience of the body and the mind, anything that's changing would not be considered your original state. Yeah. So if something's changing and impermanent, it does not have an inherent individual existence, which is, you could say it's a non-existent thing. Yeah? Meaning it's getting existence from something else. So like the clouds in the sky exists without the clouds. But the clouds cannot exist without the space of the sky. Yeah? So if things are impermanent, they would have a non-existence. There's something that's lighting the whole thing up in a way, or giving it existence, which would be your original state or your original face, let's say. The space in which the clouds move through, which is not dependent on the clouds, yet the clouds are definitely dependent. So another way you could look at that is that when there's seeing, that is not reliant on a seer or an individual. Yeah, that individuality comes after the seeing. You see, the eyes see something, the head interprets it, and then it says you're the seer. That happens super fast, but that's how the claiming works. That happens also with the ears, whatever, seeing, tasting, touching, all the senses. And then thinking. There's a thought which comes up as a mechanical movement, a habit pattern. And then there's a second thought which comes in and says, yeah, that's your thought. You're the thinker of those thoughts. So the you comes and goes. It's impermanent, you see? It's born and then it dies. But it's happening a lot. So it seems it's presenting you, the idea of you, as a permanent thing. But yet that permanent thing comes and goes. It's just presented a lot over and over and over again. But your original state is not this way. Yes, it's changeless and permanent. Okay. And then he says the difficulty comes because you are all searching for that, which is a big T that, forgetting that, big T that, is what you are. Yeah? The difficulty comes because you are all searching for that, forgetting that is what you are. You, as the subject, are seeking you as an object. You are what you're seeking. So if there's a you placed as a subject who's seeking you as an object, that would be duality. That would put you in a position of two. It would also split the idea of you, which doesn't even really make sense. Yeah, so maybe there's two yous or three yous or something. That would seem a little off. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing. So through the seeking of searching for what you are, it's from the forgetting that is what you are. So there's a you as a subject, this is what he's saying, are seeking you as an object. And it's that movement, if you're going with that because you're identified as the subject seeking the object, that will never stop. Yeah, because it's duality. The head can't become a not head. The head can't become your original face, but it's going to continue to try ad infinitum. Yeah. So it's this seeking, which he's saying, which is essentially throwing you off. The difficulty becomes because you're searching for that, forgetting that that is what you are. So you as the object, as the subject, which would be the misidentified subject, are seeking you as an object, which would be the misidentified object. Yeah. You're neither the subject or the object, but it's the seeking for the you, which has you not sitting in what you already are, you see? It's like a distraction in a way. The head is searching for liberation, except you are already the liberation. So if you go with the head searching for liberation, you're just reinforcing the idea that you're not liberated now. Huh. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of the thing about the spiritual seeking. If you are what you're looking for, or like Ramana says, our being ourselves reality, or being reality ourselves, if that's the case, which in non-duality, or not to, that is the case, then whatever presents itself after that must not be you. Yeah. One of the main thing that presents itself in spirituality or spiritual practice would be the idea that you're not that and that you're going to get there. But what's trying to get to the absolute is relative. Its nature is relative, meaning it's dependent. It doesn't have, it's a non-existent thing. It doesn't have existence, yes? So it can't become absolute because it's a relative system. That's its nature. So if you are reality, then whatever's trying to get reality mustn't be you. That must not be your absolute nature, you see? So the more seeking that takes place, or the more ideas and push and action that's put towards seeking, is only reifying the idea, false idea as far as non-duality is concerned, that you are not what you're looking for, but you're going to get there. But what's trying to get there is not you, because you are what you're looking for. This is how the seeking is very misleading in many ways. Yeah, the you that wants to be free is never going to be free. Like Ramana would say that the you that you're trying to, the individual you're trying to improve doesn't exist. Yeah. So whenever the head makes a move to say you're not, you're stuck, or you're bound, or you're this or that, that mustn't be you if you are reality. So that's why he says the only requirement is to see the unreal and know it as unreal. And then when that's seen, you land in what you already are, which is real, yeah? But any movement that's made to affirm the seeking or something is only moving you away from yourself. So Nisargadatta is saying the same thing. The difficulty comes because you are all searching for that, big T that, forgetting that that is what you are. Yeah. What can forget and remember wouldn't be you. If something can be forgotten and remembered, that would mean that it's coming and going. That's not you, you see? It's like I was speaking to a lady yesterday, and she was saying, I know that this is not real, but there's a her there that's knowing that her thoughts aren't reality. And that feeling of being the knower that her thoughts are not real is coming and going. It's part of the unreal. So she's bound to being the knower of what's real and what's not real, and that doesn't bring relief. It's still bondage. Yeah, being the knower of stuff is bondage. It's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. Okay. So The seeking would put you in the seat of being the one who wants to know. But what you already are can't be known because it's not an object. Yeah. So you can only negate what you're not, and then you'll land in what you are. It's like Annamalai Swami would say, there's only one key to all the locks. Yeah. So for him, of course, Annamalai Swami was living with Ramana. So it was inquiry. Whatever's presented in his experience, he's inquiring into who that's arising to. One key to all the locks. Now, if that's the case, and if you go out and go on the internet, how many keys are presented to how many different locks? Millions, yeah? Now, Annamalai Swami is saying there's one key to all the locks. It's very simple in a way. You either use the key or you don't. The thing is, the seeking puts you after consciousness, or the sense of self or I is like the seed, and then everything comes after that, including seeking to get back through the I in a way. Yeah. The seeking is like a big distraction if you are what you're looking for, yeah. Because the head will have you looking forever for what you already are. Because it can't find it. Because it's before things are broken into two. Okay. Anyone who has assumed the pose of a seeker will be bound. Okay. So then he says, the moment there is a pose, there is fear. So a moment there's a position taken, there's fear. Now, if you're in addiction recovery of some sort, the word fear is used a lot, yeah? Right. So as soon as you are under the guise of self, or taking the recommendations of self or the head, the only thing that can follow that is fear. So he's saying the same thing. The moment there's a pose, a position taking, there's fear. So Gangamira would always say, land nowhere, meaning don't take a pose, yeah? Or there's a great teacher in Taiwan who would say, open to everything but attached to nothing. So you're not taking a position in any point. Because a position is an opinion, which puts you there as the opinion haver, and now you're bound to self. So the moment there's a pose, there's fear. Anyone who has assumed the pose of a seeker will be bound to follow the traditional practices of a seeker, and therefore the limitations. Anyone who has assumed the pose of a seeker, somebody seeking liberation, will be bound to follow traditional practices of the seeker, and therefore the limitations. The limitations would be the limitation of duality, of being stuck in two-ness. Yes? It's like self has a ceiling. Individual has a ceiling, and it's pretty low. It can't see outside of its own doctrine, essentially. So whatever the head interprets is being interpreted to the head, and it's like a closed system, which we would call self-centeredness. And it's very limited. It even limits how the senses work, and the sense of like physical sensation in the body. It limits experience a lot, and the head compartmentalizes everything into these little different positions. So individuality has a lot of limitations in a way. It's a very isolating, claustrophobic type of way of moving through the world, yeah? So this is obviously saying that you're not that individuality, and that you look at all the different faces of it, and rather than trying to change it, you simply negate it and you land in what you are. Now, if you go into the seeking, you're going to only hit those limitations. Because individuality is in duality, which is like the phenomenal world, yes? You can't break that as self. Or in recovery, they would say self can't get out of self in many ways. In every way, sorry. So every time individuality tries to get out of individuality, it's hitting one of its limitations. So seeking is limited, essentially. You're still limited to that movement. See, Uraima? So you're limited to duality, essentially, in a way. Mm-hmm. If there's any questions or something, please ask. Yeah, I have a cold. My questions are just push things forward. So then he says, what is the purpose of all that I'm saying? It's a direct attack on identification with the body-mind. Identification with the body-mind. So the focus is on identification with the body and mind. He's not saying it's a direct attack on the body and the mind. It's a direct attack on the identification, or you could say the misidentification, with the body and the mind. Yeah. So when something arises in your experience, it arises to the sense of you, I. This is what he's looking at. That movement he's calling consciousness. Yes? Now as soon as that I comes up, there's a you here and then there's a world there. That's two-ness. That I would be the bondage of self. You are bonded then to whatever comes up. Yeah? If you are bonded to that I, then there's going to be a want to seek your way out of that bondage. Now the thing is, the I cannot get out of the bondage. Yes, because it's tied to the body. So the body can't become a not body. That would be spiritual seeking, would be trying to make the body into an ethereal or not body. That would be one of its limitations. It can't do that, yeah? Great. So rather than doing all the spiritual practices, which he mentions in here, yeah, because you're still going to be limited to the body identification. This is the thing. This is why these teachers of Advaita constantly look at the body-mind identification, which starts with the letter I, how conveniently. Yeah, because that's what has you bonded to what's arising. Is that I-ness. The beauty of the whole message is that you're not that movement. That I-ness is part of what you're not. The idea of you is part of the unreal. The one who's going to understand this is part of what is the unreal. Yeah? Yeah. So spiritual seeking can go on, and in my experience, what will happen is it will reach its limitations, and it will seemingly fail you. And then the head will be destroyed. Oh, I'm never going to get free, or I can't touch God, or whatever the hell the head is going to say. But the failure is the real success in this whole thing, because you see the mental system's limitations. Finally, yeah? So then rather than trying to make the mental system into an ethereal, glowing mental system, you just lose faith in it. You see that it's limited, and you let it be limited. Yeah? And then when it arises, you negate it. When the I arises, it gets negated through self-inquiry or whatever little method is taking place. But the thing is, this is why Ramana said self-inquiry or surrender is the only method. Because if a method is put into place, there's the sense of you who's doing the meditation method. Yes? The sense of you is part of what is unreal. So it needs to be negated or seen as unreal. Any meditation method is only going to reify the sense of you doing the meditation method. You are what you're looking for already. So any movement the head makes after that point is only going to reify your identification with what you're not. You see? Man, that's great. Because in Advaita, the identification is what has you bound to the body and the mind. The body and the mind are happening, but they're not happening to you. There's no you in the center of it that it's all happening to, yeah? So even when I'm talking here, your head is taking this in, it's interpreting it, and it's saying that you're the one who understands or who doesn't understand. Yeah? That would be the mental movement doing that. I understand, or oh, I'm super frustrated, I don't understand, and I get bound. Neither of those movements are your absolute nature. That's not your true face, not your original face, either of them. So, being the understander or the not understander, you see both of those as not you, and then you'll land in the understanding, which comes before these things. It's like there's a space of knowing which all these misunderstandings move through. So for most of my life, I was just living under misunderstandings. When my head presented the idea that everything's my fault or I'm worthless, yeah, I was identified for that. Hey, stop. I feel I'm going in circles. So CB, this is exactly what I'm talking about. What's going in circles is not your true nature. It's not heady stuff, really. What's going in circles in this method gets negated. Yeah, because the head cannot get this. The head cannot get what you are. It's in the failing of seeing that the head cannot grab what you already are is the success. So if your head is going in circles, that's not you. You're highlighting perfectly what I'm talking about. In a way, these talks just hit the head constantly. They kind of knock down the what's the word I'm looking for? They quiet the head in this way. So what's going in circles is the mental system trying to grab the idea of what you are. The head cannot grab that what you are because it's not a thing. Yeah? So when you see the head going in circles, that's perfect because you can see what you're not and it's very loud. It's like when I used to get super depressed, my highs and lows were extremely erratic. They were very fast and they were flying back and forth. And that got to a point where I just came to understand that there's no way I'm doing that because it's happening too fast. Yes? So obviously I'm not doing that movement. That is, in a way, the representation of part of this message. Because the head overplayed its hand, I can see that I'm not doing it, which would put me in a position of, well, who am I if I'm not doing that mental movement? That would be the liberation of this whole thing, yes? So when your head is seemingly going in circles, it's trying to grab on to something which it can't grab. And that's really great because the head will keep going in circles because it can't grab this message. Because it's a dual system, a subject-object system. And the object which it's trying to grab is what you already are, which is not an object. So the head will continue to go in circles. Which is really good because it's loud and you can see the mental system. You can see how erratic the mental system is. Yes? And then you don't do anything. You don't try to fix it or make it so that it can grab on to no thing because that's never going to happen. It's like we just read. This is a limitation of the head. Punya. Shanti. Isn't the whole path to allow the head to recognize that it is not I? Yeah, AJ, kind of what you're talking about is the dream. It's like, Advaita uses the dreaming, yeah, that this is like the awake dream. But A Course in Miracles uses that too. And it says we're going to use the dreaming to dream ourselves out of the dream, which is exactly, I think, kind of what you're talking about. Allow the head to recognize that it is not I. It's allowing the head to see that it's identified as I and that that's not you. Yeah. It's like we were just saying to CB there. It's like, the dreaming is all of the mental movement, right? The idea of you is what's dreamt. So dreaming is all the mental movement, but it's taken to be reality. It's taken to be the absolute rather than being relative. Yeah. I don't use the example dreaming too much, but it's talked about quite a bit. But you're dreaming yourself out of the dream. Whole path is allow the head to recognize that it is not I. The head is I. The recognition is that you're not the head, which is representing itself as I. Yeah? Good. So dreaming yourself out of the dream would be that the dreaming sometimes gets so uncomfortable, like I was just talking about, when those depressive swings would go up and down, that essentially you see that you're not doing it. Yeah? That it's a mechanical movement. Right. Which steps you back in the position of not being the doer of that mental movement. Right. Not being the doer of that mental movement. This is very important. Because there is no doer, there is no self of the mental movement. Yeah. Putting the head into its place. In a way, yes. Yeah. Because the relativity of the individual is placing itself as the absolute. There's something playing God. Yeah. So when your head sees something, it interprets that thing. You're not doing that. It's a mechanical movement. Your head is interpreting everything that's happening and then claiming that it's happening to you. So that's what's going on every second, let's say, or whenever the senses hit something. Right. Ah, I forgot what I was talking about there. But that's what's happening. The head is interpreting everything and claiming that it's happening to you. Yes? So that is the misidentification, the you-ness that it's happening to. But the head is claiming everything. So putting it in its rightful place in a way, yes, it's true, because the relativity, the head is playing God on everything. Yeah, so they talk about that in recovery. You have to quit playing God in a way. So when somebody hears they have to quit playing God, they think that they're going to stop playing God if because they're identified with the body and the mind, you see? But this is not the movement. The movement is to see that what's playing God is not you, or it's not arising to you, more so. So that when it goes out and interprets something and plays God, you see that it's a false God, as Ramana says. Right, because really, if you're identified with the body and the mind, you're not having thoughts, thoughts are having you. The habit patterns of the mind are having you, and they're driving the body, yeah, through their interpretations, which would be misinterpretations, because any interpretation is going to be a misinterpretation. So the head is playing God, but you're not doing that. It's a habit pattern. Yeah, there is no doer or one being done to. Thoughts are happening and they're taking over the system through your identification with them, through the eye of it. The eye of the storm. Abstract for the conditioned mind. Yeah. The conditioned mind, again, is relative and it can't grab this. Yeah? The conditioned mind can only grab objects. You are not an object. Your true face is not an object. Original face, not an object. Yeah, the head will never get this. In a way, you and I will never get this message. So the only movement is negation, because any spiritual practice and all of this stuff is only going to reify what you're not. And what you're not will never get what you are. The relative is never going to become absolute. And it doesn't matter how much it suggests that, it will not override the fact that it will not become the absolute. It's limited. It's running on a limited system. Yeah. Its nature is dualistic. It's not going to become non-dual. It can only be dualistic, the head. You're not going to spiritually practice the body into a non-body, ever. Ever. It can't happen. Self cannot get out of self. Yeah. Uh, Good. So, any questions, please ask. Yeah, in a way, it's extremely simple. There's one key to all the locks. It's inquiring into who. Who is all of this happening to? That is the one key to all the locks. The thing that happens, though, is people are identified as the body and as the I. So, what happens? There's a billion locks after I. Yeah? Essentially, there's the sense of you as the thinker, and then there's however many thousand thoughts a day. Right. So people chase the thoughts. They try to change the thoughts. This is often what happens. But they're never looking at the sense of doership of those thoughts, being the thinker, which is what's creating all the thoughts in the first place. If you are this body, then anything that's ever happened to this body is seemingly affecting you a lot. Because you're tied to this body as the I. Yeah? As the individual. Right. It's through that interpretation of being the one who's doing and done to that everything else comes from. Right? This is it. Practices and things are good to settle the individual down. I just did a little audio course thing on this Haku method from a Zen master, Hakuin, which Insight Timer wouldn't let me put up for some reason. But it's on my Bandcamp if you want it. Yeah, I can send the link to you. But to settle down the individual, like the 12 steps is very useful for an alcoholic, to settle down the individual. If the system's too loud, it's really hard to inquire into the thing. What do you do to get out of self? You see that you're not it. You inquire into who self arises to. Yeah? It's through that inquiry that there's a knowing before it, which knows that it's not an existent thing. There's no thing called self. Yeah? There is no self, as they would say in Buddhism. There's no individual, independent thing called self. Right? Self is referring to an action or a movement. It's like that's the best way to put it. It's like there's a bunch of movement of water, yeah? We would call that a river, but there's no thing called a river. It's just moving water which is constantly changing. Self is that. It's a constant movement which we call self because it's suggesting that you're there. Yeah, Jessica? So what do you do to get out of self? Any movement that you make identified as self would only reify that you are self. Yes? If you're identified as self and you try to get out of self, that would be self trying to get out of self. So in recovery, that doesn't work. Yeah, they know that from recovery. So you can use that. Yeah, self cannot get out of self because a limitation is that it's identified as self and it's self-centered, and it's not going to get out of itself. But you're not self. You're not the body and the mind, which is the main thing of Advaita. Yeah, you're not the body and the mind. So you have to see that your head is trying to get out of self constantly. It's trying to get out of self as itself, and that doesn't work. Yeah. But you're not it. So negation would be the only way to do it. When something arises in the screen of your experience, it would be to negate it rather than try to move with it. So when your head says, I'm bound, that you would negate that movement, or you would inquire, who is it that's bound? Who is it that has this issue? Who is the one that anxiety arises to? You, yeah? So when I ask, Jessica, if I was to ask, who is it that's in self? Yeah? The answer would be you, right? Who is in self? Who is bound to self? The answer is me. Yeah, I'm bound to self. Right. So there's something sitting before all of the mental movement. It's the idea that it's arising to you. Inquire into that I. Where does that come from inside the body? Is something there? Is there an I inside the body? Yeah, because there's not. But knowing that would put you in the place of self knowing that, you see? Any mental knowing is self knowing, which is why in recovery they say self knowledge avails you nothing. Any knowledge of the head avails you nothing because it only reinforces that you are self. Yeah, Jessica, ask more if you need. Just put it in the chat there, I can see. So what do you do to get out of self? You see self arise and you negate it. Or you inquire in from who it arises to. Yeah? One key for all the locks. Who feels bad? Who has the itch on the arm? Who wants to watch the movie? Or who is it that feels guilty for watching a movie? Yeah. One key for all the locks, as Annamalai would say. Right. And then that gets exposed to you, essentially. That the you that you're taking yourself to be is part of self. Yeah? So when the head is putting itself in the position of reality, you see that that's not reality. You see that's unreality from what you are, which would be reality. Yeah. We can't really talk about reality because any word that's put on it would put it into form, and that wouldn't make sense because it doesn't work like that. Yeah. So what do you do to get out of self is inquiry, let's say, and then at a point you do nothing, because anything that's done is self reifying itself. Yeah, or you reifying your identification with self. Which in recovery is part of the higher power thing, I feel. They see self arising and they know that the problem is your identification with it, so they just go right to a higher power, essentially. Because they know self can't get out of self. Yeah. So if there's other question, Jessica, hopefully that makes sense. So what do you do to get out of self? Who is it that's bound to self? You. And then that gets inquired into in the body. How do you go through a day with others lost in their version of self? While you are aware of the truth. AJ, who is asking that question would be my answer, I think. How do you go through a day with others? Yeah? That puts you in a position of duality right there. Just that question alone puts you in a position of duality. How do you go through a day with others? How do you go through a day with others lost in the version of self while you are aware of the truth? Who would it be that's aware of the truth? Yeah? I feel like we talked about this maybe the other day or last week or something. That would be a question from self, essentially. So it would be worth it to inquire who is it that wants to know the answer to that. Because that's a very divisive stance. That's a very separate stance. There's you here, the idea of being the one who knows self, or maybe you looking at this body thinking that this body knows self, or sorry, knows the absolute or something. And that puts you in a position of everybody else, yeah, the question you're asking. So that's two-ness right there. Obviously, that's duality. Yeah. How do you go through a day? So like how would you go through a day with everybody else? That puts you in duality. So you're stuck to the subjectivity of knowing the self. That's bondage. That's the bondage of self right there. You're stuck to being the one who's aware of the truth. Yeah? That is the root of discomfort. Right, because that's only what adds separation to your experience with the environment, which is not it. If inquiry is sitting you into any sense of separation, which that question would put you into a stance of self and other, that's the wrong direction in my experience. Inquiry should only sit you into a place of completeness. So as soon as something divides your experience, that needs to be negated or inquired into who that arises to. Who is the one that knows the truth? Yeah? The one that knows the truth, that is the bondage right there. Right. So that's why we say in recovery, self-knowledge avails you nothing. If the individual knows the truth, whatever that would mean, which doesn't really make sense because even the truth would put a form into something. If there's an individual that knows the truth, that is the bondage of self through self-knowledge. Self-knowledge avails you nothing. You see? That's very important because otherwise there's a stance of you up here and everybody else down here. And that's a super uncomfortable place to live, even though the head is constantly telling the story that it knows and everybody else doesn't know. This is not it. That's not it. That's separating experience. And that does not give the relief. Yeah. Inquiry should open up to completeness here and here. So if inquiry is placing me as the knower and everybody else as the not knower, that is the bondage of self in a sticky way. Actually, that's a sticky bondage to get out of because that sticks us to self-knowledge. Like my head was trying to get the AA program for a long time. Like it was going to learn AA or learn the 12 steps, and I was going to learn my way out of it. That failed, yeah? Because the pattern was to gain self-knowledge, to read all these books and whatever stuff is going to go on, and then I'm going to gain self-knowledge. But that's reifying the sense of self. And this sense of self, this body is infected by a cold right now, but it's also infected by alcoholism, yes? Which is super self-centered. So the idea that it's going to know itself out of itself would be a huge misunderstanding. Because then it puts me in the seat of being the sober one and everybody else being wrong. That did not work. Yeah, this is a manifestation of self, being the knower. Self-knowledge avails you nothing. So as soon as the head goes up and says, I'm the knower, and everybody else doesn't know, that is a perfect thing to see. Because that is not you. Yeah? That movement is misleading your experience, in my humble opinion. And it misleads your experience in a very uncomfortable way. Because you're up here and now everybody else is down here. And that gets super uncomfortable. Does ego create self? Swapnil. Swapnil, who does the ego arise to, yeah? The ego arises to something. Something knows the ego. Yeah? So the question isn't so much does ego create self. It's who does the ego arise to? Not a trick question. It's quite simple. The ego arises to you, yeah? Yes. Okay, great. So leave the ego alone, because that's too far down the line of what's going on. The ego arises to you. So stay with that sense of I, because that movement would be like one of the seeds of consciousness, let's say. Probably not the seed of consciousness, but it's getting closer. You got to step back. Does ego create self? Is not really the question. Who does the ego arise to? Leave the ego alone, step back one. The ego arises to me, yeah? Now a lot of people say that's the true self. And in my experience, that's not true. Yeah? The true self there is no self. That's the real movement here. But inquire into who the ego arises to. Because otherwise you're trying to change the ego. And you're not doing the ego. I don't use the word ego because it's very misunderstood. It's a really muddled kind of idea. But this message is not about the thoughts. It's about the thinker. Yeah, so ego would be like a bundle of thoughts, but those bundle of thoughts seem to arise to the sense of you. Now, the sense of you is one of the thoughts within the big bundle of thoughts. But that sense of you needs to be uprooted somehow through self-inquiry in a way. Yeah. So knowledge before self-knowledge. Does ego create self? Any answer to that would be self-knowledge. That would be the head gaining information. That's not what this is about, like we were just talking with AJ. That's not what this is about. This is to see that the head wants an answer, but who is it that that head arises to? Because if you see that the idea of you is an idea which is part of all the other thoughts and ideas, then it loses all of its weight, essentially. Right. And then you see anything that's asking a question is not your absolute nature, it's relative. Yeah? And reinforcing the relative through a bunch of questions doesn't always, it doesn't really help because it just reinforces that you're the relative or you're the one it's arising to. Right. So does ego create self? Ego is arising to something. Who is ego arising to? I, me. Who am I? Where am I in the body? Yeah? And then one key to all the locks, that would be the key. Right. Sitting in the position of being the one who knows is uncomfortable. That is not the freedom from the bondage of self. Yes? So most things that you see out there are practices looking to improve or know or understand the individual, this and this. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's relative. Yeah? There's not a profound amount of peace that comes from improving the head because the head is anxious. It's always going back and forth. But to see that when that back and forthness arises within a space of you rather than the idea of a solid you, that releases the bondage of self. Yes. Because the head always wants to know. The body and the mind wants to know. It's trying to build self-knowledge. Knowledge that self has avails you nothing when it comes to something like peace or relief. Because it's still going to bond you. And you're still going to be stuck to the body. Which is like Nisargadatta says. He's just going to keep going and going and going at that body identification. Right. So the ego arises to what? Me. That me is identified as the body. Me and body arise together. You are neither of those two things. The idea of you, as soon as you say me, the head is identifying you as a body. And those two things are bound together, which is why when the mind dies, the body dies. And when the body dies, the mind dies. Those two things arise and die together. Exactly. But both of those things are seemingly arising to you because the head is putting you in the position of claiming that you're the knower of the ego or the knower of this message. You being, the head is suggesting that you're a solid thing. Yeah? And that is the misunderstanding. That is the identification with the body-mind. When it's seen that you are not a solid thing, that you are like the space in which the clouds move through, then as soon as the head comes up and goes, I get it, you know that ain't you. Yeah. So you're not tied to being the one who knows. Knowing the ego or knowing this message, which would put everybody else in the position of not knowing this message. That sitting back into what you are has a profound influence on this body. Not through doing anything or changing this body, but by seeing you're not it. So you can leave it alone. If you're trying to change the ego or the thinking into some perfect ethereal thinking, it's not going to work. The head is not going to become absolutely compassionate. The head is not going to become non-judgmental. It's a judgmental system. That's how it's programmed. That's how it works. Yeah. Compassion, non-judgment, whatever comes before that. Before that. Judgment comes and goes in the space of whatever you are, let's say. Right.